So today we have Dr. Christopher Chen, who is an associate professor at the National Taiwan University. You have his bio and what you've seen. So what is actually very interesting is the area that he's looking at is geopolitical risks in relation to directors. So this, I think, is a very important question, especially as what's been happening recently. One of the most interesting case I would say that I had been reading was Nexperia. So that would be tied up to geopolitical risk. And I think the key issue now would be, can a director become a source of geopolitical risk? So I'm going to leave Dr. Christopher to discuss further.
Okay, thank you, guys. It's me again. So, yep, I'm really in a position where I know I'm the last installment of the whole event. So I'll try to be concise. Okay. So today I'm presenting my paper as a director at Geopolitical in Corporate Governance. It's co-written with my friend, Professor Lin Liwen from UBC, University of British Columbia. So we co-developed the idea. So I present our thoughts and findings. So in short, our research question is very simple. What if a company has foreign directors from a maybe unfriendly country? Then what might happen? So that's our key idea, how it developed. What if a company has a foreign directors? Does it present any kind of risk, especially in the era of geopolitical conflict? And as a matter of fact, I think most companies in most countries have directors from pretty much the same country. But occasionally there are companies that have a rather diverse directors from different areas. Okay, so for example, I spot this company called Philip Morris. It's a big tobacco. I don't smoke, but it's a tobacco company. I got this company because there's a data set called Boldex. And Boldex has this little data called national mix. The data set sucks, basically, because it's not accurate. For example, there's a chip company called A&D. A&D's CEO is Lisa Su. Lisa Su basically is American. She moved to America a long time ago from Taiwan, and honestly, she's a cousin of Jensen Huang. So they must have very good genes. Anyway, but the data set treat her as a Taiwanese. I said she's American. Yeah, but anyway, the data that show this company probably the most diverse company in America. Philip Morris. So those are the list of their directors, and a bit linked to what Kenneth presented earlier. So we try to know who they are, where do they come from. As it turns out, the company disclosed nothing. And I don't know their passports, unless they show it on LinkedIn, right? Nobody will do that. So it helps. Some of them does have either LinkedIn or Wikipedia. And so we can tell some of them are Greek, Polish, French, German, India, Dutch, Israeli background. I don't know who's their nationality. And the rest are, I suppose, either British or American, but we can't really tell. And in terms of pay, they're really diverse. Like this one, Boning Bob is a media guy. It's not in any way linked to tobacco. But anyway, putting this way, what if the board, a company has somebody, let's say a Chinese, in a strategy important company, what will happen? So that's our question. So we'll put it into the context. On the one hand, there was, like I mentioned earlier, there was a trend about globalization. There's a rise of multinational companies, the internalization of a supply chain. So I know every year we get a new iPhone, right? And then the next day, somebody will do the job, dismantle the phone, check all the components, where does it come from, and how much it costs. And a lot of them come from Taiwanese company. So it makes sense, right? Against the background of globalization, you have directors from other countries to actually help you to make a decision, right? It makes some sense. On the other hand, if we work on the corporate code level, so diversity is a concept that heavily promoted by OECD and the national corporate governance codes. So for instance, we search through different versions of OECD principle of corporate governance from 2004, 2015 to all the way to 2013. The term diversity appear in many, many versions. Okay, but if we search term foreign, they mention nothing, the OECD codes mention nothing about foreign director. When it's about foreign, they mostly link to foreign capital, foreign investor, especially treated unfairly, right? But they don't talk about the board itself when they are non-local people. And we look at also national codes. I think in our paper in the appendix, we search you some national corporate governance codes. In terms of, this is a topic of its own, what does it really mean diversity? But one thing pop up almost every country is gender. Whenever people talk about diversity, usually it's about gender. But some codes also mention about some other personal characteristics, usually package background, right, education, whatever. But few markets actually do clearly mention nationality, like Taiwan. I didn't realize that until I wrote a paper. Our stock change as a corporate governance code actually mentioned that you must nationality diversity among all the factors. So, but Taiwan is not alone, but most emerging market doesn't really mention nationality, all right? However, if we put in the context of globalization, there's a promotion of diversity, and then now we have a geopolitical conflict and rivalry. So when my friend sent a paper to her colleague to comment, so one comment is that it's not just about US, China, because of our background. We are Taiwanese, usually very sensitive to US and China, but it could be Russia and Ukraine. For example, you probably cannot hard to imagine. You get a Ukraine company that have a Russian director. Sounds a bit weird, right? And now it's US, Iran, and there are a lot of conflicts. Putting those conflicts, when situation arises, will there be a conflict, clash between the fiduciary duty and their national loyalty or whatever other agenda? So this is drawn by Nobu LN. So we suggest that I don't go delve too far into theoretical arguments. We suspect there could be a potential conflict of identity among directors from different countries. I don't mean it must arise. They are always traitors, right? Not everybody is kind of so loyal to the country. It depends person by person. But you can suspect there could be situation. For example, I'm sorry, it's usually against China. So a US company has a Chinese director, and large Chinese happen to be CCP party members. So where does his loyalty lies? And it's not just a hypothetical. There are a lot of American firms. They have joint venture in America, like car companies, Ford, General Motors. They have joint venture in China. And the joint venture firm, sometimes they have like an American director, but sometimes they do have local ones, or the mingle, or they have a mixture of them. So they could be potential conflict of identity. And it got exacerbated because there could be potential legal risk, and like eventually might affect how the board might function. So start from the back. We suspect there could be information flow issues. Why does it matter? Because China, for example, has this very strict national security law. Among all it's not just about spies. Part of the law is about if a Chinese, for example, pass secret information to a foreigner, there's a possibility of violation national security laws, one of them. And there are some examples. So if you are foreign director in China, you probably worry, if I get this company information and I exposed to heavy penalties, okay? And it's just not on the Chinese side. Americans has another law. They have these export administration regulations. The most recent culprit is I think CEO director from this company called Supermicro. Basically, is so chips to Chinese firms in violation of American restriction. But the whole thing about the Americans' EAR, Export Administration Regulation, is not just about physical products. Under their law, if there's certain information, like technology information, if let's say somebody move the information from, let's say, America to, let's say, a Russian, and it could violate the EAR, then penalty will follow. And if that's the case, there could be disruption to information flow. So I think in corporate governance literature, no matter it's about duty of care or the function of a board, one important thing is that information must be full and abundant, right? There must be full information. But if certain information just cannot go to that foreign director, how can he make that decision? How can the board function if the information flow inside the board is not very fluent? In addition, whenever you get foreigners, there could be fraction. I don't mean it must be foreign issue. I think we all live in, for example, we work in universities. And even, for example, in Taiwan, when everybody are Taiwanese, they are still fraction, right? But when you get foreigners, sometimes they get a separate fraction. So if the board happen to be divided along the nationality lines, foreigner versus local, there could be a conflict, and eventually that might affect how the board might function. There could be some infighting, indirectly that might affect corporate governance. So in the end of the day, on the individual level, we suspect there could be a conflict of roles. On the one hand, corporate law says that a director must be loyal to the company to make decisions for the best interest of the company. And on the other hand, at least for some people, there could be their national role, must be loyal to the company, loyal to the country, right? In certain countries, it's more obvious than some others. And there are also professional role, regardless his nationality, affiliation. What does this guy think, man or woman? What does he think? His professional opinion on something. So on this basis, we produce 4 case studies. The first one is Intel. It's once upon a time the most dominant chip maker in the world. And in last year, Intel hired a new CEO called Mr. Chen Liwu, and he's an industry veteran. He has a curious background. He was born in Malaysia, educated in Singapore. It's not NUS, it's Singapore's NTU, not Taiwan's NTU. And got another degree in MIT or somewhere. Naturalized as American some decades ago. Overall, it sounds like a great American dream story, right? Except that he did have a lot of business connection, investment in China over his long career. So after he was hired as a CEO, apparently President Trump wasn't too happy about it. And so there was some crossfire between them. So Intel was forced to make a statement, and Mr. Tang also had to make a statement. And finally, President Trump actually backtracked a little bit. So it kind of settled. But what we learned is that, I'm sorry, this case is about Chinese. It's not strictly Chinese. It just has some connection in China. And it can expose the company to some political drama, at least for a short while. Okay, that's Intel. The second one is what they mentioned many times, is TikTok. And actually, I realized Xin is also a good example, like worth some study. Anyway, put it as way, TikTok is a company that actually has a very complex web of like layers of offshore company, whatever. And like Dan had mentioned earlier, the company itself has more foreign shareholders. You also have more foreign directors. But our take is that that is not enough to make TikTok or ByteDance to look more white than Chinese. AKA whitewashing isn't enough. Okay, so we call it original sin or Chinese. That's from American angle. So that's not enough. Then that actually link back to Dan's identity point. What is it actually about? And the third case study, we shift the order in the paper a bit, Toshiba. Put long story in short, Toshiba has been a long industry group. It produced a lot of stuff from consumer electronic to nuclear power station to memory chip, whatever. And it got listed in Tokyo Stock Exchange, probably 19-something. It's a long history. So the problem with the company was that since mid-2010s, there's been a lot of scandals. Eventually, it resented the company introducing foreign private equity funds. That's a signal to Aurelio and Professor Jun, right? PE funds. And gradually, they have more shareholding. They impose more directors on the board. And apparently, they didn't get along with Japanese directors. And in the end of the day, the PE funds, they sold the company to a Japanese government-led consortium, which privatized, which is a bit sad. So what we try to pitch the story is that, of course, the whole saga can be viewed from different angles. I don't suppose there must be one angle. You can view it from stewardship, PE funds, right? Or shareholder activism, 100% is about PE funds. Or you can view it the other way, the evil Western PE funds invading corporate Japan. Then eventually made the company delisted from the stock market after 74 years, which means that no Japanese can buy the share anymore, right? So, but what we try to see, at least from our paper's angle, is that when you get strong will foreign directors on the board, you cause frictions, especially when the agenda are not the same. Okay, so which brings me to the final case, TSMC. Just in case you wonder, my friend told me, this is TSMC's logo. Other than the 4 letters, you see that's a waffle. And the waffle, there are some blue dots, right? That means the part are not good. So what TSMC is gray, sorry, that's how it be Samsung. TSMC can produce a waffle with more white than black, which means that this called yield rate is a lot higher, which means that if you're NVIDIA, you buy TSMC chips, you can maximize the value from the waffle. But anyway, long story in short, TSMC, as mentioned earlier, has been a dominant force in global chip making. And in the AI era, you also have more foreign directors than local ones. So in 2025, March, TSMC announced an enormous investment in Arizona to expand its production base in America. The investment amount probably 100 something billion US dollars, a lot of money. Okay, so question is, how should the board decide such a matter? How should the board decide such a matter? Should they go for Taiwan's interest? Or is it okay to go for more American interest, at least for those American directors? And should they make what the best for the company? So let me jump a little bit. This is TSMC's board composition. And because the Taiwan stock exchange require company to disclose nationality data, so you see there are 4 Taiwanese. One of them is a government appointee. This guy, Lin Quan, he's not appointed by government, but he's former government official for Ministry of Finance. The rest are mostly American and one British. And this guy, Ursula, I think she actually bought more shares because it's disclosed. So for them, how to make a decision? So for locals, the question is, do we expect them to say the company must make a decision to serve Taiwan's interest? For Americans, in their decision making, do they actually think about American interests? So I privately asked my friend what's his observation. He said they are all professionals, so sounds okay, but he dissents. Americans are Americans, they are not local. There are some local issues they don't bother, right? So there could be some kind of division. And in the end of the day, what matters for the company? Why should the company keep everything in Taiwan? So they are up to debate. But in the end, if the question is what's best for the company, if TSMC's most customers are in America, then what's wrong with manufacturing in America? So we don't have a proof at any sort. Actually, before that decision, they held a board meeting in America, not in Taiwan. They held a board meeting in January 25 in America. There's no proof of any sort because there's no board meeting minutes any sort of published. So we don't know that. But it does show that there could be a challenge on the board level. Okay, very quickly at the end. So a recommendation. When we wrote the paper, our struggle is how do we find recommendation? And if we cannot produce anything useful, what's the point? So we have a few things. First of all, we don't, I think they are merely having foreigners. We don't want the legislature to ban it. But we propose they should be more disclosure about nationality at least, which passport it holds, right? Sometimes it matters. And it's not a global practice yet, okay? Back to TSMC, this one is required by Taiwan, but this one is 10K, which requires nothing. So more nationality disclosure, at least the market can digest the information. In addition, the company probably wants to do a bit more nationality due diligence. Know more about the person you appoint. Okay, that's not highlight enough in the current practice. And finally, maybe the regulators should think about whether when they promote the idea of diversity, do they really want to include nationality as one of the benchmark? And we suggest it could be considered as a factor, but it probably shouldn't be enforced as a mandatory on a mandatory basis. So thanks for listening. I know it's 2 long days. I hope you enjoy, and I welcome the comment from Jennifer.
Well, thanks, Chris, for a fantastic paper. Really, really interesting, and great paper, I think, to kind of end the conference with a bit of oomph as we have the dark and stormy night overhead. I was fascinated by this paper. Its basic message is this assumption that we think about the board of directors as basically being a neutral arbiter. Now, there are lots of different theories of the corporation, and of course, Lynn Stout and Margaret Blair would say, it's a mediating hierarch, but we think of it as this neutral mediating hierarch, or we think of it as a neutral monitor. And we think of it as monitoring these various risks and being neutral in that. But what Chris and Lin bring up is this idea that maybe that's wrong. Maybe the board itself is a locus of possible dysfunction as a result of geopolitics. Now, when I started reading this paper, I thought of it very much as being, it's a fox in the henhouse idea, that we've got, secret agents on the board who are really looking out for their jurisdiction, and they're going to just do everything in their manipulative evil power to, guide the company towards the benefits of their country. But as I read further, I thought, no, there's actually two strands that are going on in this paper. And it's not only that danger that you might have someone with, overly loyal to their country. I mean, we saw in the Volkswagen scandal, the court said some of these employees were overly loyal to Volkswagen. Here, there's this danger of being overly loyal to your country. But I thought, there's also this stream going through the paper, or this strand going through the paper, of talking about hapless directors who are pushed on all sides. They've got, pressure from their country. They've got, their honour to the board of directors, etc. And I should have called that the meat in the sandwich model. So we've either got the fox in the hen house or the meat in the sandwich. And I'll come back to that of how it can make a difference. But the structure of the paper, I think Chris has, dealt with that very well. Basically, he sets out this superpower lawfare. That's very much the geopolitics that Curtis Millhop tells us about. And, coupled with director nationality diversity that we all thought was great in the era, of globalisation. He then goes through the case studies that he's just taken you through, and then he looks at corporate strategies and legal reforms to address if this really is a risk. And as I say, I think there are kind of two risks embedded in the paper. So I want to just talk about where this sits in terms of academic literature. And I think that it sits very nicely with historical literature, and I think it also fits nicely with some contemporary literature, both of which have these intersecting themes. So the paper gives us a new twist on what can undermine director efficacy, because it says, we're used to this idea of directors as monitors since the 1970s, but Victor Brudney said, what are they meant to be monitoring? And he had three things that directors might be supposed to be monitoring, and none of them were this kind of risk. So this gives us a new potential thing, along with cybersecurity and various other aspects of modern life, that directors are maybe supposed to be monitoring. Also, it's consistent with Jeffrey Gordon's paper about what allowed the structure of boards of directors to change from the 1950s onwards. The fact that information could be included in the share price so that you could have people that aren't working on a daily basis at the company. And that's either a local non-executive independent director, or it can be a foreign director. Thirdly, it sort of goes on to these various factors that a lot of literature on, of what can undermine board effectiveness. But I think what usually is, from that old literature of Lipton and Lorsch, etc., and Brudney, what would undermine board effectiveness was them being too cosy, too comfortable with one another. But as Chris has told us, this paper is not so much about groupthink and that loyalty of the group. It's more concerned with board fracturing, where you've got, one or more directors who have got these, conflicting loyalties. What about current literature? Well, I think it fits really nicely, and Chris has alerted us to some of the ways in which it fits. The globalisation versus nationalism. Mariana Pargendler, I think, had real foresight of what was coming our way when she wrote this, The Grip of Nationalism in Corporate Law, that we'd become cosy with the idea of globalisation. But she talked about how nationalism has put sand in the gears of globalisation. And, I think that's very much a message of the paper. Also, Millhop's idea that geoeconomics is the pursuit of power politics using economic means. This is a way in which that can be happening at board level. Identity literature that, Dan is writing with Curtis Millhop, and then with this forthcoming paper with Mariana Pargendler, that's all about the identity of the company, but Chris is looking at board identity, director identity, and that comes within this broad literature. So he talked about how most corporate codes discuss gender diversity. But here we've got nationality or ethnicity diversity. I mean, interestingly enough, the Australian Corporate Governance Code does talk about ethnicity, and our failed 5th edition would have talked about it at board level, but it failed in the middle of last year, so we're back to the old one. So you've got people like Shapani and Caproni talking about gender diversity. You've got specialist director literature with Nili and Shapira, and my partner, Ron Masoulis and Yao, about scientists on boards and how that can drive greater innovation. Now, I just want to finish off with 2 points that came out to my mind as I read the paper, and it's a very rich paper, so I could have spoken for an hour. In the paper, I think there's an assumption that most of these foreign directors, or certainly a goodly number of them, are independent directors. But I wondered to what extent maybe this kind of dual loyalty deprives them of independence under corporate governance codes, or some corporate governance codes throughout the world. And so I just had a look at the UK Corporate Governance Code and the Australian, and they follow a similar approach to when a director can be said to be independent. They have specific categories that, you know, put you on red alert that maybe they're not independent, but they say, you know, they're not exclusive categories. Other things can undermine the judgment. And so, you know, it's not limited to those categories. Anything that might interfere or reasonably be seen to interfere with the director's capacity to bring independent judgment. So I thought that was kind of an interesting point of, you know, have we not caught up, just as we haven't caught up with the kind of risks that directors might have to deal with, have we not caught up with what can undermine independence? And then my final point, I want to go back to this fox in the hen house versus the irreconcilable competing pressures, the meat in the sandwich view of directors. I think the paper ultimately, even though I thought it was dealing with this number one, I think it ultimately comes around much more to this number two. And when it's looking at, well, what do you do if you suddenly find you've got one of these directors on your board and it's become dysfunctional as a result of that? And the paper says, you know, and this really does go to this irreconcilable competing pressure, directors may face asymmetric access to information, political pressure from their home states, suspicion from fellow board members, or even legal prohibitions against participation. In some cases, resignation may be the only viable option. So, you know, the meat in the sandwich director just goes, this is hopeless, I can't function, and steps off the board. But that made me wonder, what if it is a fox in the hen house scenario? Or what if it is a meat in the sandwich director who just doesn't step off the board? What happens then? And I wondered, you know, is nominee director law relevant here, where, you know, if there are completing loyalties? Normally the law in my jurisdiction, Australia, says it's not going to be a problem unless we can see that someone is really harming the company's interests by preferring the person that appointed them. What about deadlock? Well, that's only going to really come about if you've got a board that's, you know, 50% foreign of a particular nation and 50% foreign of another nation, and they go head to head. But, you know, I mean, there's law on what happens in deadlock. Usually it would go to the shareholders to vote if there is true deadlock. And, you know, what about if it's just board dysfunction because you've got one maverick fox in the hen house, or a meat in the sandwich that won't step down from the board? And that took me back to a paper that I wrote in 2010, which I'd forgotten I wrote about this particular issue, but I think it's kind of interesting here. There was a big intra-board conflict at National Australia Bank at the beginning of the 2000s, and one director basically went to the shareholders Oh no, the board went to the shareholders and said, we want you to remove this annoying director who is making our life hell. That director then put forward a resolution for the shareholders to remove the entire board. So a real bloodbath at National Australia Bank. It got settled in the end, but what happened after that was Coca-Cola Amatil started to put a contract for their directors saying, if you are tapped in the shoulder by the other board members, you agreed to step down. Our regulators said that was illegal under Australian law, but I think it's an interesting question of different jurisdictions might have different rules about could the board remove a fox in the hen house, or would it have to go to the shareholders to remove that director if it's causing board dysfunction? That's all I have to say. Thank you.